Hi, everybody, and welcome to our meeting. This meeting's been hosted by Galway Alliance Against War and Free Assange Ireland. My name's Detta McLaughlin, and I'm a member of both organisations, Galway Alliance Against War since just after 9/11, and Free Assange Ireland. We are a number of activists who are working for Julian Assange, who got together a couple of years ago to form Free Assange Ireland. I'm actually going to start the introduction now as people are joining the webinar. So the title of today's meeting, If Wars Can Be Started by Lies, Peace Can Be Started by Truth. And this is taken from a speech that was made by Julian Assange at an anti-war demo back in 2011, after he'd released truths about Iraq, about Afghanistan wars, about Guantanamo Bay. And if we think what was happening when he gave the speech, it was at a time when the US troops were still in Afghanistan and Iraq. NATO was embroiled in Libya. And the demonizations of Muslims, a phenomenon known as Islamophobia, had become firmly established throughout the Western world. So if we fast forward to today, what do we see? Julian Assange has been persecuted. His character's been assassinated. He's been incarcerated for years. And now he's been condemned by the United Kingdom to an extradition to the United States, where he's actually going to face 175 years prison sentence simply for revealing truths that the powers that be did not want revealed. Now we've got a situation where Russia and the US are fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. NATO and the EU are piling billions worth of arms, weapons into Ukraine. And the Russian president, Putin, is now the new bogeyman, and Russia is being vilified and demonized. So Galway Alliance Against War and Free Assange Ireland, we wanted to open the conversation really and to raise awareness about what's going on under our very noses, whether that's on a global basis or whether it's locally here in Ireland. So we wanted to raise the issues that really the Western powers don't want us to either read about or hear about or even see any evidence of. So, for instance, what's behind the war in Ukraine? There is a history there, and why isn't it being told? And what's the real agenda? Is it about US and NATO expansion? Is it about the EU, including Ireland, about militarization? What about the double standards and the hypocrisy when you look at the other wars that are going on around the world, like in Yemen and in Palestine, and the way that Ukraine's being dealt with in relation to those other wars? And why is the only narrative that's allowed the one that the Western powers want to be heard, seen, and read about? The other thing, why are politicians and why are the mainstream media allowing this or actually enabling it, facilitating it? Another important question, what's happening to anybody who dare challenge the said narrative or even give like background or alternative analysis? And in light of all this, just why is the case of Julian Assange so important, not only to the powers that be, but to us in our own homes? So we're going to discuss these and other issues. And for that, I'm going to pass you over to Niall Farrell, who's going to chair today's meeting. And he's also a member of Galway Alliance Against War, founding member of Galway Alliance Against War and of Free Assange Ireland. And Niall will chair the meeting and introduce our fantastic range of speakers. So over to you, Niall. Thanks very much.
Fáilte Riv Galere. I've got a few housekeeping points to make. It has been suggested that if we all turn off our cameras, apart me, of course, of me, then we'll get a better reception. Anyway, we have 7 speakers. They will run in the following order. Noam Chomsky will be first. George Galloway should come in second. Eoin Murchú will be third. Harry Browne, both of Eoin and Harry speaking about censorship in the Irish media. And then Clare, Daly and Mick Wallace speaking about the EU or whatever they want. And then John Pilger on the Assange case and the war on China. So we intend to dedicate the last 15 minutes of the Zoom event to deal with questions, right? So if people have questions, write them in the text chat and they will be handled by the host. So I want to introduce Noam Chomsky, but that shouldn't be a problem. But I would like to warn you beforehand that over the next 2 hours, what you're going to hear is pure sedition. It is so seditious that none of our speakers would be allowed to set foot in the studio of an Irish TV or radio station. However, in this Kafkaesque world that we appear to live in at the moment, I think you will find that much of this seditious talk will actually turn out to be plain common sense. So enough on that. The first speaker today is Noam Chomsky, the renowned US academic, linguist, philosopher, and political activist. He is one of the great men of the global left who has a unique perspectives. One may not agree with everything he says, but as they say in Irish, Ken Doher, what harm? There's no harm in that at all, quite the opposite. Noam initially agreed to be here live, but then another engagement intervened. So instead, we had the following chat with him a few days ago. And I started, and I'll read out the question that I put to him. And then what will happen is we'll go to the film, his response, and there will be initially 5 seconds. For 5 seconds, the screen will go dark. Okay. So my question was, what is your assessment of the Washington NATO narrative on the Ukraine crisis that is being propagated throughout the Western world? It has taken on McCarthyite proportions with witch hunting of opponents and unprecedented censorship across the Western media. We go to the...
Well, I agree with your comment with one qualification. It's not entirely uniform. There is, what's happening in Europe is close enough to what you're describing, but it's much worse in the United States. So, for example, just to give you my own experience, I'm constantly having interviews and discussions on national radio, national television, major media in Europe. In fact, I just finished one in Portugal, others in Belgium, Germany, elsewhere. It is inconceivable in the United States, totally inconceivable. Everything here is totally shut to the extent that you can't even find out in the United States what the Russian positions are. What are they proposing? What are they saying? You can find it out if you access Indian state television or the Arab press or other places which haven't moved to totalitarian control of information. And this is not only outrageous, it's suicidal. How can you have an opinion on what's happening if you're not even allowed to know what the Russians are saying? Well, it makes a big difference. So, for example, one of the things that's happening right now is the threat of massive starvation in the world. The Black Sea region is in fact, the major food, fertilizer, and so on exporter. There are millions of people literally facing starvation in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, because of the cutoff of food supplies. You take a look at the Middle East, Yemen, worst tragedy in the world. Almost 100% of their food comes from there. Egypt, 80%. Lebanon, about the same. Much of Africa, even worse. Well, is there anything to do about it? There are actually two views, but we only hear one of them. One view is the US view. The way to deal with this is to basically sink the Russian Navy. That's what it amounts to. Send sophisticated anti-ship missiles, which are indeed highly sophisticated. They never leave NATO control. They've already succeeded in destroying the major flagship of the Russian fleet. Now let's extend more of them to break the blockade. Russia's blockading. So we'll break the blockade by violence. There might be some consequences to that. Russia doesn't take much imagination to think how, say, the United States or Britain would react if some enemy was destroying the fleet. Well, let's put that aside. We're not allowed to talk about it. There happens to be another point of view, which you can't discover in the United States. That's the Russian point of view. I should be precise. You can discover it on marginal websites, which nobody in the country even knows about, but which happen to be rather reliable. One of them's a libertarian-based website, antiwar.com, which is highly reliable and gives information. So if you turn to that, you can read a Russian proposal as to how to end they're also very concerned about the starvation. Say, here's a way to end it. Partially relax sanctions on Russia so that Russia can begin to release fertilizer and food and also withdraw the blockade. Well, there are two possibilities. The one in the West is automatically violence, use more violence. The Russian one happens to be, let's seek some kind of diplomatic, nonviolent alternative. In the West, you can't hear that unless you go way at the margins. Our increasingly totalitarian culture doesn't allow it. Now, this shows up in many other ways. Take a few truisms, pure truisms. The war, which is, of course, criminal aggression, an atrocity comparable to the US-UK invasion of Iraq, the Hitler-Stalin invasion of Poland, major war crime, can be ended in two ways. One way is through a diplomatic settlement. The other way is rejecting a diplomatic settlement and just carrying out a grisly experiment to see if maybe Russia will just walk away in total defeat. Putin will slink away with nothing, and that'll be the end of him. And that's one possibility. The other possibility in this disgraceful experiment is that Putin will use the weapons that, of course, he has, everyone knows, to devastate Ukraine and to set the stage for long-term nuclear war. So far, this is just logic, nothing to debate about. Those are the two options. It can either be capitulation or diplomacy. There's no other alternatives. Well, after having spelled out the logic, let's look at the facts. Should we should we try to reach a diplomatic settlement? putting an end to the horrors, an end to the starvation over the world, an end to the race towards global destruction through heating the climate, which is happening, increased by the war, of course, race to nuclear disaster. Should we do that? Or should we just run the experiment? Well, actually, there are two views on this. Europe has begun to move towards steps towards diplomacy. You look at the statements by Scholz in Germany, Macron in France, Draghi in Italy, have all been issuing tentative efforts to move towards a diplomatic settlement. The US and Britain are firmly opposed, firmly, explicitly opposed. You can read Liz Truss in England, President of the United States. No negotiations. The official position of the United States, announced by the State Department, is we cannot take into consideration any Russian security concerns. Okay? No diplomacy. The US official position now is we must continue the war to weaken Russia. Okay? So let's run the grim experiment, kill lots of Ukrainians, starve people in the third world, race towards climate destruction, maybe nuclear war, because we have to harm Russians. That's the official position. It was just announced recently, a couple of weeks ago. It had been clear for a long time, but was announced forcefully at the US Air Base in Ramstein, Germany. The US called the NATO powers and others together, the so-called contact group, to a meeting. They didn't call the meeting in Brussels, the NATO headquarters. They called it in a US Air Base in Germany. That's more than symbolic. That says, I'm the boss, you follow orders. There, the United States stated that our goal in the war is to harm Russia. Okay? That means continue the war with all of the consequences I mentioned. Britain, now a loyal vassal of the United States, as it has been for some time, races along behind us. Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, same thing. Well, there is then a degree of difference between Europe and the United States. What's happening in Europe is crazy enough, but it's not as bad as the United States. We can see this in many other ways. Just to give you one telling example, in the United States, it is imperative to call the war the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. That's an edict. Nobody stated it, but everybody has to follow it. If you do a quick Google search, you'll get about a million or so hits for unprovoked war on Ukraine. Well, now try an experiment. Look up unprovoked war on Iraq. Nothing. Few cases, if you look into them, they're all marginal people from the anti-war movement. No, I doubt that there is a single statement from anywhere near the mainstream whoever said unprovoked war on Iraq. In Ukraine, everybody has to march to command and say unprovoked war on Ukraine. Now that's significant in itself, even more significant if you look at the facts. The war on Iraq was totally unprovoked, not a hint of provocation, none. So it is the unprovoked war on Iraq. The war on Ukraine, which is criminal aggression, was certainly provoked. It's not even hidden. A couple of days ago, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, proudly announced that since 2014, NATO, meaning the United States, has been pouring advanced weapons into Ukraine, increasing joint military exercises, military training of Ukrainian army. Last September, right before the invasion, the Bush administration announced officially that these efforts are going to be increased. More weapons, more training, more military operations, all part of what they called an enhanced program to move Ukraine towards membership in NATO. That was extended in November by a charter signed by the Secretary of State. Last March, this is right after the invasion, the State Department announced what I'd said before, that Russian security concerns cannot be considered in any discussion. We haven't considered them and we won't. So the invasion was definitely provoked, which of course doesn't justify it, but we have to march in a parade, chanting slogans determined by the doctrinal system. Unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, same across the board. In the United States, literally, you cannot even find the positions of Russia unless you go to exotic sources. So when you talk about McCarthyism, it's an understatement. In my entire life, which is pretty long, I've never seen such complete closure of discussion and debate. Yesterday in Davos, Henry Kissinger, of all people, made a statement saying we should move towards negotiations, diplomacy, which of course means something for each side. Otherwise, it's not diplomacy, it's capitulation. He was bitterly condemned across the spectrum for appeasement, being a Putin worshiper, every kind of attack you can think of, because of a voice of sanity. Henry Kissinger is not my favorite person, but he happened to be right. What we can do is we have to change that. Can be done. It's not impossible. I'm just giving the dark side, which happens to be realistic. But there are popular movements, mostly young people, who are taking to the streets, who are demanding that this be changed, who want to change in policy, not only on the murderous, self-destructive campaign to destroy the environment, but on the rest of it too. Well, they are not being supported by my generation, not by your generation, but that can change too. And the change doesn't just happen in the United States. If, say, Ireland takes a strong stand in support of the European effort for diplomatic settlement, for overcoming instead of exacerbating the climate crisis, for ending the race to nuclear war, if Ireland does that, it has an effect. Has an effect in the United States, has an effect on Europe. Everyone, wherever they are, can do something significant to reverse this race to catastrophe.
Sorry about that. I disappeared for a minute there. And what Chomsky says is indeed true. We're on that race to catastrophe. And unfortunately, the Irish state is happily going ahead. Noam Chomsky talks about the role we could play, Ireland could play if it was positive and proactive as a neutral nation, and sought to promote diplomatic settlements of conflicts. But unfortunately, he did mention the Ramstein meeting, and in actual fact, this week we got back, or Catherine Connolly, the independent TD for Galway, got back the answer to a parliamentary question on behalf of the People's Movement, whether Irish representatives had attended the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which was set up as part of that NATO meeting in Ramstein. And the answer is yes, the Irish had senior people from the military and the Department of Defence in attendance. So it emphasises there is a role for Ireland to play a positive one, but at the moment we are on the road to catastrophe, which is sad. It is criminal, in fact. Now, there's been in the midst of Noam Chomsky's address, we got news from George Galloway, and we're going to have to make a slight change of plan. So Eoin Murchú should be combing his hair and whatever. We have a slight change of plan. George had hoped to do to contact us by phone, but the area he's in, maybe he's near here. The area he's in, the reception for the phone was too poor, so he's going to send us a video. So what we'll do is we will now turn to the whole issue of we're starting our live screening, and we will now turn to the issue of the Irish media and censorship. Now, of course, we and those of us old enough will remember that censorship is not something new. We don't even need to go back to Liam O'Flaherty's first novel being the first novel being banned by the Irish state. We can come a lot closer to the 1970s and the 1980s when Section 31 was on the TV and the radio, and people like Jenny McGeever, who was an RTE newsroom reporter, got sacked by RTE as a consequence of, and this is quite incredible, of including the voice of a non-named Martin McGuinness in her report on the funerals of the 3 IRA members who were shot dead in Gibraltar. It was a report she did on the border, and he had apparently been talking to some of the relatives. And while we today might feel exasperated, certainly I do, by the lack of interest from Irish journalists and Irish journalism about the persecution of Julian Assange, I remember that none of Jenny McGeever's colleagues in RTE down tools in solidarity. Indeed, when the NUJ eventually challenged Section 31 in the courts, the union turned not to their Dublin journalists, but to a leading Irish language journalist in the state-run Raidió na Gaeltachta, a close comrade of ours, Joseph O'Cuig. The others came in on board once it got to the heady heights of Strasbourg. But this brings us nicely to our first speaker, our next speaker, rather, or maybe our first, Eoin Murchú, former parliamentary correspondent of Raidió na Gaeltachta. He has an interesting story to tell, both about the Ukraine and how that has been received in the Irish language media. Over to you, Eoin.
Hello, Margaret and Niall. Well, the foremost international issue today, quite clearly, crying out for critical analysis, is, of course, the war in Ukraine. But the problem is there is no critical analysis. No context is provided from official news services as, for example, what precipitated the war, and therefore what is necessary to end it. As Noam Chomsky has pointed out, you cannot hear what the Russians propose, or if it is even mentioned at all, it is just dismissed as hyperbole, lies, and not worth talking. The end result, Russia is demonized, and that's it. Putin is a thug, and that's it. And there is nothing more needed to understand what's going on. In Ireland in particular, we are living through a veritable tsunami of pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian propaganda, much of it expressed in straightforwardly racist terms, that Russians aren't really Europeans like us, they're really barbarians. Our news services blandly report what really amount to Ukrainian disinformation claims in relation to the war as if they were verified reports, with accusations of war crimes and genocide even thrown so continually against the Russians that, frankly, there are few in Ireland who do not believe them. Russian rejections of such claims may be mentioned in passing, but no details of the rebuttal are ever given, as if, again, there is nothing really to consider here. Completely missing from the official narrative is the idea that sorry, I just missed myself there. Yeah, completely missing from the official narrative is the role of NATO, led by the US, first of all in promoting the coup of 2014, and now, in the words they use themselves, in prodding the bear. Provocation, if ever there was one. Senior US politicians and commentators, Noam Chomsky mentioned Kissinger, have warned that taking Ukraine into NATO would produce the reaction that we now see. But frankly, it seems that US strategists were happy to force things to this path. In Ireland in particular, there's been a sustained campaign to equate Irish nationalism with Ukrainian nationalism, to compare our struggle against British imperialism to this fight against Russian imperialism, to reject completely the reality of Nazi influence in the coup and indeed the current policy of Ukraine, even in respect of the notorious Azov battalion. There is widespread public acceptance of this narrative, with even forces in the South that were distinguished by a strong hostility to the struggles of Northern nationalists since 1969, now pretending to be horrified at Russian imperialism. And the people of the Donbass, Russian-speaking and for the most part ethnically Russian, are compared to the Northern Protestant community, which has sided with British imperialism in our country. There is, of course, no such equivalence. Firstly, the present territory of Ukraine includes the Donbass and littoral regions previously known as Novorossiya, which were added to Ukraine by the Soviet Union in 1924 to give that territory a stronger industrial base. This was an administrative economic decision which had nothing to do with the nationality of the people who lived there. Novorossiya historically became Russian at the end of the 18th century, when the Crimean Khanate and the Tatar movement was defeated, and the Eastern Slavs drifted back into territories from which they had been forced out by the destruction of Kiev Rus, the first Russian civilization, by the Tatars. Russia also, of course, defeated the Tatars in Crimea and settled that territory at the same time. And at this same time, Ukraine proper was freed from the control of the Great Horde and its Khan. But the people of Novorossiya, then, are decidedly not planters or colonists. They are not people who've been brought in to steal land from the native Ukrainians or to supplant them. It's worth noting, too, in passing, that in Western Ukraine, Galicia, this was formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then of Poland, before being incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940. Its East Slavic dialect is now being promoted as the purest form of Ukrainian, even though it is in fact heavily influenced by Polish. Emergent Ukrainian nationalism in Galicia in the 19th century unfortunately became dominated by a strong anti-Semitic and xenophobic ideology, which preached the need to eliminate Jews, Russians, and Poles. The Nazi invasion gave these forces their opportunity, to put their ideas into practice, led by the notorious Stepan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator now declared a hero by those who carried out the coup on the Maidan. The Donbass, it should be stressed, does not speak Galician Ukrainian, but after the coup, attempts were made to ban the use of Russian and force this dialect of Ukrainian as the only state language. When areas in the Donbass fought against this, they were subject to a military onslaught by the Kiev regime, which from 2014 onwards has resulted in 14,000 mainly civilian deaths. Not a word of this is heard on the Irish media when we look for context. As regards the nationality question and language, Ukrainian and Russian are in any case closely related languages, which only began to develop distinct variations from each other as the Crimean Khanate came to an end. Irish, by contrast, is a totally distinct language from English. An Irish nation was formed not as a split off from England, not as something emerging from England, but in our own historical pattern, as Gaelic Ireland assimilated the various immigrant communities that came here. But such has been the strength and the breadth of the pro-Ukrainian propaganda that we've been subject to, that any dissenting voice is silenced. Throughout the war, there has been only one occasion when RTE, our national broadcaster, broadcast a partially sympathetic voice of a Russian view. An interview with the US economist Jeffrey Sachs, who suggested that Russia had a point, even though he disagreed with the war. It was apparent that his views came as a surprise to RTE, and such an interview certainly has not been repeated. Irish language coverage is generally more open, less subject to the constant surveillance of those who would censor. But even here, deviation from the line has not been allowed. Despite being the most prominent Irish language journalist with knowledge of Russia and Eastern Europe, I have not been asked to participate on any programs in relation to the war on Raidió na Gaeltachta or on TG Ceathair since the war began. A proposal by the TG Ceathair programme Shachor that I take part in a discussion was vetoed by station bosses. And our Najib producers were told that if I were used to cover purely Irish political affairs, I should no longer be referred to as a political commentator. The only outlet that let me write about the war has been Tuairisc, and the editor of Tuairisc has come under massive pressure for continuing to publish me. A host of people have gone on the public record demanding that this platform be taken away, ranging from language activists like Cruthur O'Lehan, Donacho O'Hela, and Liam Cahill, backed up by establishment figures like Ed Brophy, the former political advisor to Joan Burton when she was a government minister. Twitter has a myriad of tweets demanding that the editor of Tuairisc explain himself. Those are the words used. Explain himself in regards to letting me have this platform, while I am widely accused of having blood on my hands and even of being a paid agent of Putin. A good example of all of this are the comments made by Diarmuid Coffey from New Zealand, who has not only demanded that the editor explain himself, but has claimed that banning me from the publication would not be censorship. It would just be a wise business decision for the publishers. A nod is certainly as good as a wink. The point of all of this, of course, is to frighten people off from challenging the establishment narrative, so that even the hardship and recession that are a consequence of the sanctions program will have to be borne in silence. If you object to the sanctions, then you're in favor of killing Ukrainians. And of course, from the beginning, the distortion of what was involved was used to try and advance the idea that we should abandon our formal neutrality and join NATO, just as the military men in Sweden and Finland have got their way on this in their countries. As Chomsky was saying, Ireland could play a very useful, progressive, and effective role using our neutrality to promote diplomacy. But instead, our government has done the exact opposite has thrown out neutrality to one side, is campaigning to join NATO and the European army, and is avoiding any effort to replace sanctions and war by diplomacy and peace. But despite the government's efforts, it is clear that a vast majority of the Irish people, as they have shown in opinion polls, oppose the abandonment of neutrality. 67% in the last poll stating that they were in favour of maintaining it. Now the government is switching tracks to urge that we get involved in the proposed European army and stand, so they say, with our fellow Europeans in resisting this Russian aggression. And the same government which resolutely refuses to convene a citizens' assembly to discuss how to prepare for a border poll to reunite our country peacefully, now wants to convene such an assembly to discuss joining the European army. They won't have a citizens' assembly to discuss peace, but they want one to discuss war. To point out the role of NATO in all of this, in provoking this conflict, would damage the government's strategy. And that is why it is so important for them to suppress debate, even as those who bleat about supposed censorship in Russia actively practice censorship themselves. The last resort is to argue that in any case it's all irrelevant because Russia has invaded a sovereign state which by implication had a sovereign right to join a military alliance hostile to its neighbour. In the real world, such a right has to be considered in terms of its impact. And, of course, in terms of the 1998 European Security Agreement, which Bertie Ahern signed on behalf of Ireland, an agreement which stated that while every country had the right to determine its own security, it should not, under the terms of the treaty, do so by threatening the security of its neighbours. And so back to sanctions. Despite the clear fact that these sanctions do little, if any, damage to Russia, which is already reorienting itself to the east, but which are devastating Europe's economies, our government, relying on the massive support for Ukraine which has been created, is determined to play its part in strengthening US dominance over Europe, no matter what this costs the Irish people. That is why it is so important to challenge the official narrative, to understand the context, and to spread as widely as possible the information contained in the arguments that we have made in this webinar. Erai Marshin Leshanova, Erai Marshin Leshavirina.
Right, the next speaker is Harry Browne, who's not only a journalist, but also he lectures in media studies, so he has an in-depth knowledge of Irish journalism. Many of Ireland's journalists have passed through his tutorials and lectures, so it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. Harry, by the way, has a very strong stomach. I know that as he wrote a biography of Bono, and that is not a task for the weak-hearted or the weak-stomached. Here's a quick flavour of the book. Quote, Bono has the glow of humanity, but in reality, he is used in the service of the powerful. That's the name of the title of the book is The Frontman Bono in the Name of Power. Over to Harry now.
Thanks so much, Niall. Ask my gastroenterologist about my strong stomach. I may have done it in that Bono book. It's lovely to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the subject. I should point out, and I will mention something about this later, that I have actually been on Irish television talking about this subject on Virgin TV. And I'll tell you more about how that went later on. I have spoken. I'll try to keep this brief. Actually, I'm going to put my timing on because I know there's quite a few speakers and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. I've spoken to the Galway Anti-War Alliance before. I admire their work. I've been involved in other anti-war work. And usually when I do so, I speak as an American. I grew up in the United States and therefore consider myself to have a special responsibility to address my home country's militarism. but also as an Irish resident and citizen now, who's thinks it's extremely important that Ireland not only preserve and protect, but also project and make use of its military neutrality. In this situation, I also speak as someone with a small amount of extra knowledge of Ukraine. I worked for a few weeks in Ukraine some years ago, traveled around the country quite a bit, saw just really how bad that country's post-Soviet experience has been. I think this is something that is often forgotten in the discussion about this war, is that insofar as Ukraine has been trying to throw its lot in with the West hasn't done a hell of a lot other than arm it in the last few years to bring Ukraine into the circle of whatever degree of prosperity we may enjoy in Western Europe. Anyway, my experience and my knowledge of Ukraine heightens my opposition to the Russian invasion, my horror at it, and my disgust that it took place, and my opposition to the elements of great Russian chauvinism that drove the war. There are other complex reasons and background that previous speakers have talked about. But my knowledge and experience also makes me skeptical about all the talk of unity, the unity of the Ukrainian people, because I saw and I know a country that was very divided, not only linguistically and culturally, but politically, a country that was, in addition to being poor and desperate, was also very corrupt. So I've been skeptical about the idea of Ukrainian unity, and certainly then skeptical about the image projected in so much of our media about sort of the world's unity in opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and in opposition to Putin. It's clearly not the case. That the countries, most of the countries with the largest population in the world, have generally maintained some kind of neutrality, sometimes neutrality tipping in the direction of the Russian position. And as we've already heard from Noam Chomsky, the unity of the so-called West and the unity of Europe is also something that has been enormously exaggerated from the start of the war, and something that we are seeing further cracks in as the war has progressed over the last 3 or so months. There clearly is a difference, as Professor Chomsky pointed out, between the UK-American position, which Ireland has tended to heave closer to, and the position that's emerging in Central and Southern Europe. I also come with a journalist's and media scholar's principled skepticism of what we actually know and see about a war, and understanding that wars are conducted in a deep fog, a fog that is partly a consequence of the chaos, the multi-dimensional and multi-locational aspects of war, but also deliberate fog. We know that both sides in this war have really pulled the shutters down on how they have been conducting the war. Certainly, we hear a lot about Russian censorship, etc., but the Ukrainian side has made it very, very difficult for journalists to operate. And essentially, most of what we've heard from Ukraine through Kiev and Lvov has been essentially filtered through the Ukrainian state's public relations operation. I do think, and this is probably partly a consequence of the kinds of divisions that we have talked about there, that the cracks are showing in this sham unity around the war. I mean, just this week, I think it was a journalist, I think from the Financial Times, who was on Morning Ireland, who actually said in relation to a particular place in the Donbass region where the Russians were making advances, that there were some civilians in the area who were waiting for the Russians, i.e. who would be sympathetic to the, if you like, the conquest of their territory by the combined forces of the Russians and Donetsk and Luhansk military. And I would also say that there has been in the major newspapers here a marked decline of interest in the Ukrainian war, in the Irish Times and in the Irish Independent. And I think this comes part through a number of elements, a combination of the recent successes, if you like, of the Russian campaign. And also, I think probably of the apparent strength of Irish support for neutrality. As Eoin Murchú pointed out, there is 67% strongly in favor of maintaining neutrality. And, this latest maneuver by Varadkar to suggest that maybe a European army, we could be neutral in a European army, if not in NATO. But in any case, I think that to the extent that the Ukrainian war was potentially a stick with which to beat neutrality on the behalf of an element of the Irish ruling class, it's clearly not proven strong enough to put a dent in that rather strong edifice, and at least in that edifice of public opinion in support of neutrality. So the stories that we've been getting about the Ukrainian war have tended to be relatively small recently and Irish angled, for instance, about Ukrainians here who've decided to go home. Nonetheless, this has been an important moment in the media here and abroad. And I'm going to talk about censorship, and was very struck by what Eoin Murchú had to say about his own experience with censorship. But I want to talk first a little bit about partisanship, which I think has been a very important dimension of media in recent years, partly driven by the particular emotional demands that are thrown up by social media engagement. So it's largely the case that when media organizations believe they have a story to run, they seek to do so by intensifying the emotional engagement of an audience, to identify an enemy, to engage against that enemy, to build solidarity with one side. And we see this on a number of issues, but as Noam Chomsky pointed out there, and it was very striking given his age and experience, that he's never seen such a one-sided partisanship in the American media. And I think that's largely been the case here as well. I probably read the New York Times more than I read the Irish Times. I remember there was a spell there in the first month of the war where virtually every day the New York Times accused Russia of intensifying its attacks on Ukraine, intensifying. The word seemed to be in a headline every day. And I would read through the stories with great interest and in great detail, looking for the evidence of intensification. Now, obviously, there were appalling details of what was happening in the Russian attacks on Ukraine, but the evidence of intensifying was lacking. But it was like they needed to use the word intensifying precisely to drive this emotional engagement. And the one time that I was on Virgin TV talking about the war myself a few weeks ago, I saw the consequences of speaking skeptically about the war in the Twitter reaction to my appearance. It was largely emotionally. It was the opposition was expressed largely in emotional terms. I'm so upset you let this man speak. How dare he say this about Ukraine? It was very much not engaging with the substance, but rather with the affect that they believed had the affect of emotional solidarity had been interrupted by what I had to say. And I think that relates then to the other aspect that I wanted to speak briefly about, which is this censorship. Censorship that is largely achieved by attaching all questioning of the American, Western, or Ukrainian state narrative, all questioning of that party line, attaching all that to the position of the enemy. So that, we even saw this in relation to Micheál Martin accusing Paul Murphy of parroting Russian propaganda in the way that he was blaming the government for the cost of living crisis. So that even if you question the party line on the domestic economy, you can be called a Russian bot, in effect. And I want to just talk briefly about how this censorship relates to the concept that has emerged with huge importance in this recent period, which is disinformation. The word disinformation, like the word propaganda, has effectively ceased to have any useful meaning beyond meaning essentially what we don't like to hear, or even maybe more appropriately, what we can usefully demonize. And as a kind of an interesting evidence of that, I had recently an email that was sent to the School of Media where I teach, inviting our students to take part in a counter-disinformation platform. I'm going to see if I can actually share the leaflet here. It looks like you can see it here. Yes, a public editor, a new tool for tackling disinformation. Online training by the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, the Alliance for Europe, which is a kind of a pro-EU NGO, and Goodly Labs. And it sounds, I mean, I think everyone should go and do this training for tackling disinformation, because when you go to page 2, you find out that there's real money behind it, including money from the United States Department of State. So the disinformation training to counter disinformation being offered by the Alliance for Europe is essentially an American government-funded effort in order to ensure that everything that is, if you like, labeled as disinformation is precisely what the United States State Department wants to see labeled as disinformation. So the campaign around disinformation, I believe, is very much a campaign of censorship. And of course, we've seen it on social media, where anyone who's ever been interviewed on Russia Today gets to have a little label under their name, calling them Russian actors. Perhaps George Galloway will have something to say about that. I'm skeptical about all definitive truth claims and about the capacity of anyone to label disinformation, whether on a gamified platform sponsored by the American State Department or otherwise. And I must say, even in relation to the theme of this talk, I also have a kind of an inbuilt skepticism about any principle that links the idea that if we somehow get to the truth, that we'll achieve peaceful outcomes. I honor people like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. I very much admire them for the price that they've paid for believing that the truth will set us free and the truth will bring about peaceful outcomes. But I think that we can also see in the fate of those two men, or sorry, of that man and that woman, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, and in the fate of the fate of the world in the decade or so since they revealed the truths that they did, that the truth doesn't necessarily set us free. But I do think that we need to be opposed in principle to these kind of censorship campaigns, and that we do no good morally or politically when we blinker ourselves to the realities and the complexities of war. And indeed, I think the political situation in Ireland is such that we can and should attach continuing importance to the maintenance of our neutrality, and that includes the importance of a neutrality, if you like, in the information sphere, that the people of Ireland understand themselves not to be part of the British and American world of censorship, and we should keep it that way. Thanks very much.
So I'm back here. Thanks very much, Harry. That was certainly a provocative contribution, and maybe we can discuss it a bit further later on in the event, or some of the speakers might want to deal with it as they speak. Now, I'm being told by the Galloways that they are actually here to Zoom, but I don't know. I'm waiting for confirmation of that. If they are, then I would simply hand over to George to speak. Does anybody know what the story is? I'm getting complete silence on that.
Is it possible that they're under another name? And if that's so, maybe they could put it into the chat.
No, it's if it's anything, it's Gaeltachta Galloway, but it's a Galloway surname. But I've asked them anyway. Look, whilst we try to sort that out, we'll now turn to the situation we've talked about the Irish media and its impact. Those working inside it are trying to work inside it, and how the likes of Eoin Murchú has been airbrushed. And then we look at how the Irish media haven't actually airbrushed Clare Daly and Mick Wallace. They've indulged in frenzied attacks on them. And it really reminds me of the bad old days of the Troubles, where that was a regular occurrence. If any opportunity, if you were putting forward a particular viewpoint that the establishment didn't like, then you were seriously shafted. And anyway, I know that neither Clare nor Mick are interested in discussing that, but it is, for us, we need to raise it because it is basically a threat. It is a threat to to other politicians, that they will be fearful of getting involved in such things. I think we'll have to go on to if Mick and Clare are still there, I would go over to them, and in the meantime, we'll try and find the Galloways amongst the thousands that have assembled here at this event. Can that be done?
Hello, can you hear me?
Ah, there you are.
Oh, we were here all the time, listening to every word. I'll try and be brief.
That's not possible.
We'll be first anyway. That's not true. But anyway, Clare wanted me to go first. So listen, just to pick up on a few points that were made by Harry, which I found very interesting. And it just, only on Thursday evening, on Thursday morning, we had a session in Foreign Affairs, and we were discussing the accession of Ukraine to the European Union. And I just reminded them of the fact that the European Court of Auditors, which is probably the most impressive body that we've come across in the European Union institutions, and God knows there's not many impressive out here. But the European Court of Auditors done a very thorough investigation into European money spent into Ukraine over a period of time. And they came up with a report. It was published I think it was the 23rd of September last year, so it's only about 7 or 8 months old. And they were so damning of what was happening to European money in Ukraine. And I'm just going to read you a short extract of what they said in the report. And it said, for more than 20 years, the EU has been supporting Ukraine in its reform agenda. Tackling corruption, which is a major obstacle to a country's development and runs counter to EU values, is an integral part of that. Grand corruption and state capture are endemic in Ukraine, as well as hindering competition and growth. They also harm the democratic process. And they went on to say that despite varied support the EU has offered to Ukraine, oligarchs and vested interests continue to undermine the rule of law in Ukraine and to threaten the country's development. Now, at the meeting, and at several meetings of late, there's been a big push to accelerate Ukraine's accession into the European Union. Now, the European Union likes to boast that they have rules about who can come in and who not, and the way you have to get your house in order around the judiciary, rule of law, around corruption and all that. You have to sort all that out before you can get into the European Union. Well, according to the European Court of Auditors, Ukraine last year, back in September, was the most corrupt country in Europe, according to the European Court of Auditors. And they reckon that there was no evidence that the European Union money spent in Ukraine had achieved any value. That was the verdict of the European Court of Auditors, who are an institution within the European Union, but a pretty independent one. Now, Harry mentioned about funding media and how media are operating, right? I heard fellas this week in the European Parliament from the Commission and the European External Action Service actually boast about the fact that they're funding independent media in places like Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova and where not. They're funding independent media. I mean, it's scarce, right? I mean, I'm sure there's people funding independent media in Ireland too, but I don't really want to go to that space. But I mean, when you're funding media somewhere, you're actually buying an opportunity so that your message is put across rather than someone else's. But we're struggling to actually call a spade, and the amount of talk about propaganda and disinformation in the European Union for the last few years is astounding. But as Harry said, disinformation, well, I mean, it's pretty widespread. And but myself and Clare, we've argued strongly for a long time that everybody engages in disinformation. Everybody engages in propaganda. But to listen to some of the mainstream media across Europe, you would think that it was only the bad boys who did that. It was the likes of the Russians and the Chinese and others and other authoritarian states that engage in disinformation and propaganda. Whereas we're the good ones. We're the ones with democracy, whatever the hell that means anymore. I mean, they like to think that democracy is actually an opportunity to vote once every 4 or 5 years, and that's democracy. What is it now? That's like saying that they also like to say that human rights is being allowed to say what you like, and freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But human rights doesn't seem to entail the right to a house or access to an affordable standard of living or to affordable healthcare. I said at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and I was obviously criticised for it because we're kind of in the minority out here, believe it or not. But when I said that Russia engages in disinformation and propaganda, that's a fact, I said. And so does everybody else. They have a problem with that. And I said to him, you know what? I said, there's not many people in Europe at the moment that actually believe a lot of the propaganda being put out by the Russians. Whereas in actual fact, like in Ireland, for example, an awful lot of people actually believe what RTE and Irish Times tell them. So who's the better at it? Are the Russians any good at this crack? I don't think they are. I think they're fucking shite at it. I don't care how much money they're spending on it. The Russians are shite at propaganda and disinformation. They are engaging in it, but it's not working. But we're much better at it. We buy and sell them because it's working for us. Do the surveys. What percentage of Irish people today actually believe what Irish Times and the RTE are telling them? Loads of them. Scary. Just shows how good they are at it. That's one of the challenges we have. But look, going back to the war, right? I mean, we have probably rarely seen such a joyous occasion in the Parliament as when the war started. The amount of MEPs across the various parties were just delighted that the war happened. It almost justified their raison d'etre. And the opportunity has not been wasted. This was a chance, this was an opportunity to crush the dissenting voice. This is an opportunity to crush an anti-war movement. Now, you might say, well, it's probably in trouble as it is. The anti-war movement is not as strong as we'd like it to be. And we have the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, Keir Starmer, actually saying that being part of an anti-war movement and being against the war in Ukraine is not compliant with Labour Party membership. The Labour Party is not compliant with membership of the Labour Party. It looks like that Tony Blair did. But the media have been relentless. And we have seen the likes of Finland and Sweden. Now, after all the years, when the Russian army were all over Eastern Europe, countries that are now in the EU, Finland and Sweden were okay not to be in NATO. But in actual fact, for all practical purposes, they've kind of been in bed with NATO now for a while. They've been moving in that direction anyway. But of course, they can't put it to a referendum. Oh, they haven't time. This is too serious. Right? We can't be giving the people to say on this matter because they might actually be quite as many of them in favour of it as the media in Scandinavia are telling us. So, I don't know, we haven't got time to put it to referendum. But I mean, we're trying to remind them, as I say, who are NATO? I mean, it's a post-war mechanism designed to maintain US dominance and control of Western Europe and to advance US geopolitical interest. And for many years, it was used to violently suppress socialism in Europe. This is NATO. It's a war machine. They've never had anything to do with peace. Someone tell me, when did NATO ever have anything to do with peace? What did they ever do for peace? They were involved in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans. What did that do with peace? How come no one's actually asking that? We've Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael now, who actually, I mean, they've always actually felt that they'd love to be in NATO anyway, but they couldn't say it because the majority of the people were against it. But now they'd see an opportunity for maybe the people, we've been so supportive of the refugees coming from Ukraine, which has been very good. And it's great that we are supportive of them. Speaking, we're not supportive of all the others. But so they see this as an opportunity now to undermine the anti-NATO position in Ireland, to undermine the basic desire for neutrality in Ireland, despite the fact that our neutrality is pretty vague, given that we allowed the US military use Shannon to destroy the lives of millions in countries that have mostly Muslim populations. But putting that aside, the Irish people generally kind of like the idea of being neutral. If De Valera had sided with the Germans in the Second World War, he'd have been bombed by the Brits. And if he sided with the Brits, he'd have been bombed by the Germans. Well, he wasn't so foolish after all not to take sides with either of them. And there's a very good reason as to why we should stay neutral. And Chomsky pointed out in his speech that we actually have the potential to actually play a good, peaceful, neutral role now, but we're not playing it. With Micheál Martin coming to Strasbourg this week to tell us how wonderful everything is in Ireland, and we've stabilised the economy despite the fact that it's at the expense of half the population, and so many people still haven't recovered from austerity, which was a crime against humanity. He's going to tell us about how supportive they are of the EU, the European Union, how wonderful it is and how great everything is. I mean, this is a load of bollocks. The French and the Germans had the audacity to actually look for peace, which something Zelensky didn't do before the war. They tried. Unfortunately, they didn't have the backing of the US and NATO. Only last July, there was a big meeting in July where the French and the Germans were looking to initiate peace talks with Russia on the Ukraine issue. But this has been simmering for a while. And the Poles and the Baltic states blocked it. But obviously they have the backing of the US and NATO. Where are we going with this? I pointed out the fact that we're looking now to accelerate the accession of Ukraine into European Union. Has anyone actually looked at how this will impact on European citizens, given that we're about to take on the most corrupt country in Europe, according to the European Court of Auditors? We're going to take on a country that has probably a stronger Nazi element, who have been armed by over half EU member states in the last while. They're probably the strongest element within the Ukrainian military at the moment. There was boxes of guns opened on the streets of Kiev. You didn't actually have to sign for it. You didn't have to sign for the gun. You could just get one. Where are these guns going to go? Do people remember what happened to the guns that went to Libya? Do people remember Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were cheerleaders for the bombing of Libya in 2011? Fucking cheerleaders for it. And what happened? They destroyed the wealthiest country in Africa, the one where people had the most, where women had the most rights and were in the best positions in society all across Africa. They destroyed a country that is now back to a situation where the slave trade is back. And we have a European Union that's funding the Libyan Coast Guard, who are involved in it today, still. And we're boasting about it because they stopped migrants coming to Europe. What happened to all the guns that went to Libya? The Sahel, which is sub-Saharan Africa, got the spillover from Libya. That's the other parts of North Africa. The place is a basket case. Poverty levels are over 70%, literacy over 70%. The jihadists are running amok. The EU has spent 8.5 billion in the Sahel since 2015. And I asked at the Foreign Affairs Committee on Thursday, have you any information about how well your money was spent? Was there any value for money? What did you do with the money? Did you spend any of it on infrastructure? Because we're giving out with Chinese building fucking railroads and apartments in parts of Africa in order to access fucking mineral wealth. And I'm sure the Chinese are not down there for the benefit of the Africans. They're down there to access mineral wealth for themselves, same as everyone else does. But at least they're not going in with guns. They're actually building some of the place, and the Europeans are giving out about them. How much of our 8.5 billion in the Sahel alone was spent on infrastructure or developing the people from a social perspective? How much of it? I got no answer. The amount of guns that have filtered out of Libya into this region and destroyed the lives of millions is astronomical. Do Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael give a damn about that? They supported this. They still don't criticise what NATO did in Libya. They actually think it's a good idea. They supported the war in Afghanistan. They supported the war in Iraq. What's wrong with them? They're not prepared to tell the truth about what's going on in Syria. They're wedded to US imperialism, who've been at war for 250 years of their 275-year existence. They're wedded to it, and they're proud of it. What is wrong with them? How in God's name are we still putting Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in government? We've had a right-wing government for all 100 years of our existence, since our so-called independence in the Brits. We just abandoned one imperial power and took on another one. How big a role has the media played in making sure that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are in power all the time? How big a role has the media played in ensuring that the war in Ukraine is the only war that ever mattered? A UN report in December said that over 400,000 were dead in Yemen. 15.8 million have been driven into extreme poverty, and no one gives a fuck. Do you know why? That's our war. Europeans are involved in that. With the Americans, they've supported the Saudi UAE genocide. Now that is a genocide. Myself and Clare Daly were ostracized, were fucking condemned from a height because we suggested that arming the Ukrainians and pouring arms into the place wasn't a great idea. how come no one has suggested pouring arms into Palestine for the Palestinians to defend themselves from the Israelis? Would that go down okay with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? Would they be okay with that? Would they like to give guns to the people of Yemen to defend themselves against... The only bombing that's taking place in Yemen is from a US, EU-supported Saudi UAE effort. The Houthis and the Ansarullah, they've no planes. They've dropped no bombs. They're trying to defend their own people. Why aren't we concerned about those refugees? They reckon that 1 million people could die of starvation in Afghanistan because of the sanctions. Why doesn't the Irish government care about the sanctions that are starving people in Afghanistan today? We spent 20 years destroying the place, and now we want to starve them with sanctions. We steal their money that belonged to the state. How come Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have no problem with that? Why? How come RTE have no problem with that? How come the Irish Times have no problem with that? Listen, I better stop talking. Let Clare talk for a while. Good luck.
Okay, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk now, Niall, or if George is coming in, but I mean, I'm happy to do so. And I've been really impressed by all the speakers so far, so I'm not going to go on hugely long, but I mean, I think, you know, the Galway Anti-War Alliance is truly crazy. The fact that you've organised this webinar on a Saturday afternoon on a bank holiday weekend.
When Ireland are playing Armenia
exactly.
in a football match.
It gives an indication to your commitment, but also the large numbers who've tuned in kind of gives great, I suppose, support and solidarity to all of us, because all of us are the victims of a one-stop shop war where there's only one show in town, only one narrative, and all of us know that life isn't that simple. Now, other speakers, and you, Niall, made the point that we have been demonised by the Irish media, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to sort of work that one out. Pages upon pages of vitriol levelled against us for having the audacity for, I'm not actually really sure what, but voting against the European Parliament resolution, which was in favour of sending more arms into a conflict zone, which up until a couple of months ago was actually illegal. It was common sense. Nobody ever did that, because when there's a war on, what you should be doing is de-escalating. But I think to try and be positive about this, we have been, and we're very conscious that a job has been done on us in Ireland. And that job is partly to do with the war, but it's also partly to seize the opportunity of the war to silence that voice that Ireland always returned to Europe. So it may have been represented before by the likes of Patricia McKenna or Joe Higgins, but that Eurosceptical, anti-militarist, anti-neoliberal voice that was Irish people always returned to Europe. It's that voice that rejected the Lisbon Treaty, the Nice Treaty. And the first thing I would say is that we should be proud of that. So the media tells us that's an embarrassment and a disgrace. For me, that's brilliant. And not just for me, for loads of people around Europe, that is brilliant. Because if you remember back to Nice and Lisbon, loads of people in Italy and Germany and other countries said, please, Ireland, reject these treaties, because you're the only ones who have a say in this. We don't get that opportunity. So when we're talking about Irish neutrality, we should be very clear that our neutrality is a precious gift for the whole people in the whole of Europe. And we should really fight on that and be conscious that there's people all over Europe who want us to keep it. Now, you wouldn't think that if you were in the European Parliament, whereas Mick says we are demonised and vilified, but you should be aware that every day, despite the hatchet job that's done on us, we get contacted by people from every corner of Europe, probably every corner of the world, thanking us for speaking out for peace and diplomacy. And we should, and actually from every corner of Ireland as well. I've had a lot of people contact us from Ireland saying, listen, we don't know how you do it, but look, we are grateful. Your voices aren't being heard in the media, but there's loads of people who think like you do. So keep doing what you're doing. And we definitely know that those people are in Ireland, they're in Europe. Surprisingly, most people we get contacted from are huge numbers from Germany, from Italy, from Sweden, but also from every point of the globe, actually. So that's a positive message that I think that everybody tuning in here. We are the voice of the majority. We're the voice of the majority of the peoples around the world, the 165 countries in the world that are not sanctioning Russia. And it's not that those countries think that Russia are doing a great job, go in and kill Ukrainians. Of course they don't think that. But they themselves have been the victims of US imperialism or wars, and they understand that there is a bigger narrative than goodies and baddies here. So I think we should take great solace in that we represent that voice. I think we should take great solace on it as well, that we represent that voice in Europe, because we have got to where we are today. This is the consequence of Nice and Lisbon and so on. Yes, Russia are responsible for invading Ukraine, but as other speakers have said, they were prodded and pushed into it. They shouldn't have fallen for it, and they bear responsibility for that, but they did. And who is laughing and who is benefiting? It is the military-industrial complex, it is the US, it is NATO. And that's not an accident. This was in place, so we've had out of Lisbon and Nice, and sadly Ireland did reject it on behalf of the people of Europe first, but then we had to vote again. And then the embryos of that led us to the European Defence Fund. For the first time in the last budget, direct EU money being spent on defence. So we have a multi-billion euro budget now on defence. We have the European, and how did that come about? It came about by the European Union asking, how do we secure European defence? So who do they ask? The citizens of Europe? Maybe. God, no, that would be way too obvious. So they formed what they called a group of personalities. 9 out of the 16 were the defence industry. And surprise, surprise, they recommended that to secure Europe's defence, we should invest more in defence. And those companies were the beneficiaries of that. So to the tune of billions, with the European Peace Facility, which replaced the African Peace Facility, which specifically outlawed European money being spent on militarism. The European Peace Facility allows European money be spent on European arms to be given to Africans to fight themselves in civil wars or whatever. And then when they try and escape that conflict and come to Europe's shores, the very same companies benefit from the multi-billion euro contracts from keeping them out of Europe. So this is big business, and this is what is fueling this war. The amount of money that the US has put in, 40 billion being pledged to Ukraine. As we said before, most of that money won't leave the US. It's money that will go into US arms companies to benefit US arms. And the victims of that are first and foremost the people of Ukraine, then the people of Russia, then the people of the rest of Europe. So when we say that, we're the ones, it's like we're the ones who want to kill Ukrainians. And yet those who like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and Fianna Fáil now just can't get enough of Ukraine. I don't think there's a hotel room left in Kiev with the amount of Fianna Fáilers who are going out there to take part in viewing the war. These are the very people who facilitated the US military using Shannon to carry out their theatres of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So these people directly have blood in their hands, yet they portray themselves as being the sort of harbingers of peace and the defenders of Ukraine. It's a nonsense. This is a warmonger's dream. That's what this is. And the silencing of our voices in the media is part of that, because it is the military-industrial complex that is winning. And at every single meeting we go to, be it security and defence, be it transport, everything now is money for militarism. It's an open checkbook. Billions of your money, European citizens' money, is going in this regard. And, you know, it has been said like that Germany and Italy and France have talked about peace. Yeah, they have, like really timidly, because they're afraid as well. Such is the avalanche of the propaganda machine that's in place. There is chinks there. But the sort of maniacs in the former Soviet states who are whipping up this anti-Russian massive rhetoric, it's been in place since we went to the European Parliament. So, I mean, I remember some early meetings of security and defence where they were arguing about, in their usual anti-Russian stuff, about how awful the Russians were. And I made a point about, neutrality and peace and all that. And this Polish fella screaming at me saying, how dare you? He said, you don't know what it's like. We were occupied by Russia. You're on the other side of Europe. It's all right for you to talk. And we said, well, actually, yeah, we can talk because we were occupied by a bigger neighbour. But nobody is saying that the answer to that is go out and rearm the IRA. What people are saying is the answer to that was a negotiated peace settlement. And like it or not, Eastern Europe has to make its peace with Russia. We all share the one continent. The sanctions, I'm not going to repeat the points, the militarism, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. We're pauperizing the citizens of Europe, and we are making Europe much more unsafe for all of our people, including the people of Ukraine. It's gut-wrenching to see people who couldn't give a toss about peace in Syria or in Afghanistan or Iraq, and that, promoting themselves as a sort of harbingers of peace. And, it is mad for all of us, as for all of the other speakers, how we have been demonized. And it's a little bit scary in some ways. But, when we look at our message, is actually, ironically, the same as the Pope's. Condemning Russia for the invasion, but saying there has to be dialogue and negotiation, and there's more than goodies and baddies in any narrative. So when the Pope said that, they couldn't call him a Putin puppet, so they just silenced and ignored him. And what a pathetic spectacle the media is. But we should take solace that around the world, the majority of the world's population can see through this, but they just haven't got the vehicle for expressing it. And I'm not saying that it's easy. It's not easy. But let's look at Ireland, because that's where we're from. We're a neutral country. We are very much embedded in Western democracy, whatever that nonsense is, but we're pro-American. The Irish diaspora are bigwigs in the United States of America, and we're firmly in that camp. Yet we come from a country that was oppressed by a colonial neighbour. Most of the powers in the European Union are former colonial powers, and the conduct of them, as Mick outlined, is a modern day colonialism. Like, they give out about, oh my God, Russia and China are in Africa. How dare they, when we're down there, but we're promoting values and democracy. They're down there benefiting themselves. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. This is their modern day colonialism. But we're a former victim of colonialism. At the heart of the European Union, we can bridge all of those gaps by our neutrality. So my God, that is a nugget that has to be preserved, which is why the powers that be in Europe have their sights on it. We have on our shoulders, I suppose, the battle to preserve a space in Europe for neutral powers. If Ukraine is ever to join the European Union, and I don't care if they do or not, it's up to them. If they're mad enough to agree to the neoliberal reforms that would go with that, or whatever you're having yourself, or Moldova, a proudly neutral country, are we saying that they can't be neutral and in the European Union? So we should be really proud that this is a positive thing. Instead, we have Micheál Martin, like the best European boy in the class. I mean, we dread to think what he's going to say on Wednesday. He's going to be horrifically servile in terms of being the best European. But you know what? European citizens like the message that we've been given. And we know that because we hear it from them. And maybe it'll demonize us. And maybe they can succeed in convincing the Irish population that we're an embarrassment and a disgrace in Europe and they shouldn't re-elect them. So be it. The fact that we have this platform now and the ability to raise these points, we're really glad that we do. And we know that it's something that's appreciated across Europe and actually across the world. So to all of ye in Ireland who are tuning in on a bank holiday weekend and who are fighting your own fights in this, we're all on this side together and we're all trying to grapple with it. And I know that our voices aren't being heard mainstream, but actually in the hearts and the minds of people really do appreciate it because people aren't stupid. Now, sadly, some middle-class Irish Times readers actually are, particularly a lot of the people in the Dublin constituency, I would say, and I've got their emails and all the rest. But actually, ordinary working-class people and people around the country in Ireland aren't stupid. and they know that life isn't black and white, and that you have to make peace with your enemies, no matter how you like them or how you don't. And this conflict will only be ended by dialogue. And wouldn't it be a great idea that we do that sooner rather than later? How mad is that? Not mad at all, not criminal at all. To us, it's a message that needs to be heard. And the only people who lose from that are the military-industrial complex, who actually deserve to lose. So look, we're really grateful to everybody for tuning in. We want to fight this fight and use it as part of battle to defend our neutrality, because aren't we so lucky that we have it? We're the only people in Ireland or in Europe who have a chance on this. The Danes have come part of the European defence mechanism. Finland and Sweden will be hurtled into NATO, but it's not the people. It's not the people. And those who speak in the European Parliament were elected by a minority of European citizens. The disconnect between the citizens of Europe and the European institutions isn't because of Russian propaganda, even though they tell us that it is. Believe us, it isn't. It's because they don't represent the views of the people. And the last point I'll make, because we haven't given them enough of a plug, is the position of Julian. We went to see Julian in the embassy, 8 years ago now. It's a shock to us that his plight still goes on. He faces extradition, as Detta said at the start, imminent now, any day now, to the US, where he could be incarcerated for 175 years. Already, it's had a massively chilling effect on those hypocrites in Europe and in the NUJ in Ireland who talk about freedom of the press and so on, and who have abandoned this man, the one who exposed war crimes more than anybody else. What can we do about that? Well, we really just need to keep shouting the shout. To me, I think Australia, but also it's interesting, the president of Mexico has offered him asylum again. We should be championing that, saying, yeah, what of it? He's a sick man. If he goes to the US, he'll probably die. Let him go to Mexico. If the Mexicans want him, let him have them, or champion that. So we need to redouble our efforts to stand by Julian and to demand his release, one of the greatest individuals who held power to account. So look, thanks to Galway Against the War Alliance for today. We think it's really important. You might be mad by holding it, but we appreciate your insanity.
Well, can I just, in our defence, say that we were intending to hold it last weekend or the weekend before that, but every weekend that we tried to organise for, there were First Holy Communions, and we've got a lot of our supporters are deeply religious. So I'm telling you the truth, we couldn't get a hotel. So anyway, it ended up like this. And I would also point out that don't talk to me about Ireland playing anybody tonight. It isn't Ireland. It's the Free State playing that foreign game. Anyway.
Not far from me.
I know. Hold on a second. Could we mute him? Thanks. Thank you. He spoke long enough, said somebody there in my back. You're right. Now we're going to go on. I want to thank you both for speaking. I particularly want to thank, having mention of Julian Assange. And I would say in reply to Harry, in respect to the issue of truth and whether truth is important or not, the importance of truth is seen in the way they are trying to destroy and are destroying Julian Assange. For me, that is clear. That is what they fear is the truth. And that's why we've got to get it. And it'll certainly, I can tell you from my experience on the streets of Galway, the collateral murder video changed a lot of people's attitudes. Okay, we are now going to turn to Comrade George Galloway. And George doesn't really need any introduction. Certainly in Galway he doesn't, because he's spoken more times in Galway than he, in fact, as guest speaker, I think he's been on our platform more times than he's been on any other person has been on a platform. Certainly Mick and Clare, they're very difficult to get if you live in Galway. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, we'll now turn to George, because George's analysis, and I think is a breath of fresh air, and one can listen to him every Sunday evening on the mother of all talk shows, So we will now go to a video that he's recorded on the move in Britain today.
Good afternoon, Galway, and indeed the wider world. It's a rare privilege to hook up again with my good friends, Niall and Jenny, and my other friends going back many years now in the Galway anti-war movement. I was, in fact, on Wi-Fi, finally, and was ready to speak live when I heard Niall say that I couldn't. So I have now repaired to the video workshop, as it were, and I apologize for the confusion and the inauspicious circumstances in which I'm recording this. I'm unavoidably outdoors and could be interrupted at any time by one of the remaining supporters of the war in England. So if the camera goes flying, you'll know that the wrong person went by. I did hear much of Noam Chomsky's address, and it's of course an honor to share a platform, even virtually, with him. I didn't agree with everything that he said, but let's concentrate on the areas that I did agree, because they are actually more important than what we call the Russian action in Ukraine. I agree with him that it was mightily provoked. I don't agree with him that it was an act of aggression or a war crime by Russia. As a matter of fact, the aggression is all coming from the opposite direction, not necessarily from the coup regime in Kiev, but from the NATO military alliance, Murder Incorporated. Anyone who wants to persuade you that NATO has anything to do with being a defensive alliance is obviously very young or older, but very forgetful. Tell the people of Yugoslavia, this war in Ukraine has been going on for a long time, but the Russian involvement's been going on for 100 days, just a little more than the number of days that NATO bombarded Yugoslavia and dismembered it. Having broken up most of it, it then dismembered the remaining part of it and unilaterally created a new state, which they all then recognized, saying that Kosovo is a state, whilst denying the rights of the people of the Crimea, or for that matter, Lugansk and Donetsk, to self-determine their decision to remain or not remain in the Ukrainian state, is, as a matter of simple logic, merely foolish. So I didn't agree with Professor Chomsky's analysis of the Russian action. I think an action which is provoked mightily, and not over 100 days, but over 8 years, indeed, perhaps more than 8 years, perhaps going back to 2004, and the breach of the solemn undertakings that were given to the then Russian leadership under Gorbachev, that the NATO murder gang would not advance 1 inch. That's the phrase that they used, not 1 inch. You don't have to believe me, you can believe James Baker, then Secretary of State, who wrote it copiously in his memoirs. And it was on that basis, foolishly, you may say, I do say, that Gorbachev accepted the reunification of the 2 German states and the Russian-Soviet withdrawal of forces from the eastern part of Germany and the acceptance of Germany entering NATO. All of these were provocations of the highest order. But the proximate cause of Russia's action 100 days ago was the very clear decision that had been made by the coup regime in Kiev, with the backing of Washington, with the backing of NATO, to re-invade Lugansk and Donetsk. The line of control had been a murderous line of control for 8 long years. 14,000 people died on it. That's when the actual shooting war began 8 years ago, not 100 days ago, and 14,000 Eastern Ukrainian people, many of them ethnic Russians, many of them Russian speakers, none of them, virtually none of them, wanting to remain in a Ukraine dominated by the coup regime authorities in Kiev. The relentless killing of these Ukrainians was a daily provocation to Russia. And you'll remember the invention of RTP, the right to protect. It was invented by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. And they made it clear they were arrogating to themselves the right to intervene anywhere if they perceived or claimed that people needed protection, that they had a right to protect them. Now, it's all very well saying I didn't accept RTP. I didn't. But RTP is here to stay. And it's not just for the goose. It can't be just for the goose. It must also be for the gander. You can't say that Western countries have an RTP, but Eastern countries don't have an RTP. And yet that is being denied in any analysis of the Russian action in Ukraine. They were exercising their right to protect their compatriots, their nationals in many cases, their ethnic compatriots in almost every case. So for these reasons, I don't agree with Professor Chomsky, but on everything else, I do. Particularly two phrases that he said that rang out to me. And the first one was this McCarthyism. This is the new McCarthyism. I can show you my scars if you like. I have been removed from the mainstream airwaves, removed from the Sky Broadcasting Corporation. The BBC would be more likely to invite Vladimir Putin for an interview than they would invite me. Same with Sky News, ITV News, the so-called Liberals' Choice, Channel 4 News. None of them want anything to do with someone like me, with the perspective that I have on the war and how it's likely to end. Not only that, people like me have been extirpated from social media, unjustly, falsely branded. I have a legal action going on in the courts in Ireland right now to have removed the false brand that I am somehow Russian state media. My wife wishes I was, because then we wouldn't be as broke as we are. We can't earn any money, because even giving an interview for £20 or £40 payment to Russian media would see me prosecuted with a maximum sentence of 7 years imprisonment. I might end up next to poor Julian Assange in Belmarsh. So we have been not just extirpated from the mainstream media, but from the social media portals as well. People are worse off than me. Some people have been banned. Scott Ritter, an expert in war, a former United States Marines officer, has been literally wiped off the social media map. Lee Camp, many, many others have been not just ignored, we're used to being ignored, but it being made impossible for anyone to hear our point of view. Now, there's two problems with that kind of McCarthyism. The first is obvious. It makes a mockery of the idea that we live in a democracy. You know, I'm old enough to know that that was our trademark. That was our leitmotif. That was the jibe that we used to throw at other people in other countries, that they were not free to speak their mind, whereas we were free to say anything that we liked. So it makes a mockery of this so-called rules-based order that they keep talking about, which is very different, of course, from international law, from the United Nations Charter. But if it has any leitmotif, it is that we are free countries, we are democracies. That is made a mockery of. by the current McCarthyism, the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy, described by that great English man of letters, Dr. Johnson, as the grimmest dictatorship of them all. And the second reason, more important reason, why this is unconscionable is that if you don't know both sides of the story, how can you possibly know that your side of the story that you're believing in is true, is right? If you don't know how the war is going, how can you tell that it is the right thing to do to go on reinforcing it? Don't reinforce failure is a military maxim of very long standing. Well, what if the war in Ukraine is becoming rapidly and massively a failure? Then why reinforce it? The answer is virtually nobody in Britain. I don't think it's any different in Ireland or in most of the countries that call themselves the West. Nobody knows that the war is now going disastrously wrong for NATO and its puppet regime in Kiev. And if they don't know, then popular demand for a change of policy can only be generated at vast and disproportionate cost, which we simply cannot afford. And so we head further and further in the direction of what Professor Chomsky called catastrophe. It is the road to catastrophe because there are only, as he put it, two ways that this can end. It can end in a diplomatic settlement agreed by both sides with something in it for both, or it can end in capitulation. And if you believe that Russia is going to capitulate, at least before unleashing its military potential to end the world and the human race on it, then the capitulation is bound to be on the Ukrainian side. And the longer that that is delayed, the more painful that capitulation will be. It's already the case that the Minsk II agreements would have avoided the war altogether, signed by the Ukrainian government, guaranteed by the French and German governments, never implemented. But the Minsk II agreements will not do now. The price will have to be much higher now. And that price for Ukraine and its friends is only going to rise. The McCarthyism that we are seeing today is worse than McCarthyism. It is sweeping up, of course, large numbers of people, but more important, it is leading the Western public deeper and deeper into a vortex that could end in absolute catastrophe. McCarthyism did not have those level of stakes. Now, Chomsky and Pilger and me, I'm sorry to say, have racked up quite a lot of miles on our clock, our collective clock. But we've never been this close to midnight. The clock is very, very few minutes, maybe even seconds from midnight. The doomsday is not that far. It is discernible, and more discernible than it has ever been in my lifetime or in the longer lifetimes of Pilger and Chomsky. If that's not enough to wake you up from your torpor, I really don't know what would be. I try every Sunday night at 7 o'clock on the mother of all talk shows on the remaining platforms available to me for the moment, and I hope that you watch it, because you'll hear arguments like you've heard today on a weekly basis. And on a Wednesday night, only on YouTube at 10 p.m. London time, you can hear me on the Galloway Show. Big thanks to Jenny and to Niall and to all the brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, who are participating in this worthy initiative today. Thanks very much.
Well, I think I thought that was an excellent address by George. In fact, he hits on something that I would like to mention we have been, he's saying we're seconds away from nuclear war. We're seconds away from nuclear catastrophe. And our next event is actually going to be on August 6th or 7th. It's our annual Hiroshima Nagasaki Day in our square, where we try to have a bit of kyo and a guest speaker. So I've just asked people to note that in their diaries if they have diaries, and if they haven't, sure, write it on the back of your hand and just don't wash your hand for a few weeks. Now we're going to turn to our final contribution, and this is with John Pilger. John we tried to get him to be here to attend live. Again, the problem was he's in Australia, which is 9 hours away, so it makes it a lot more difficult. So the intention what we decided to do was do a video with him, and we arranged that, and that happened the day before yesterday, where we wanted really to talk to him about Julian Assange, and also about Ukraine, and also its links to the forthcoming war on China, which is a film John Pilger actually made. So I think he made it back in 2016. Now I'm going to tell everyone over this is coming from New York, by the way, somebody I'm talking to here, is going to start showing our interview with John Pilger. Thank you.
John, thanks for joining us today. The first question really is, in your view, is the blanket censorship we are experiencing here in the West connected to the persecution of Julian Assange?
Well, I think they're both intimately connected. Julian is emblematic of a wholesale assault on our right to know, on our right to dissent, our right to live in a world that isn't constantly threatened by the prospect of war. So much comes back to Julian. I mean, WikiLeaks in 2010 released two extremely important documents. It released, over the years, it's released a trove of government documents that have informed us so much about the policies, the real policies of our government. But these two were to do with Iraq and Afghanistan. Known rather cynically in Washington, especially Afghanistan before it ended rather abruptly, as forever wars, perpetual wars, which was almost a policy in the United States, that we would live in a time of perpetual war. Julian and WikiLeaks revealed that for what it was. That the United States basically was threatened by the presence, the rise of China, and that its own dominance was at risk. And that's so much in the world is tied to that. The US wishing or striving to reclaim the dominance it had. Only actually for the complete dominance was really up to, I suppose, the 1990s. And it wants to go back to that. So all so-called foreign policy, which is a ridiculous term,
is tied to the US regaining that dominance. Now, WikiLeaks and Julian revealed what that dominance meant. It meant violence. It meant terrible things happening in country after country. Perhaps we knew that already. Certainly, I've spent most of my career, it seems, reporting on that. But WikiLeaks brought it down to the lies they told in their own words. So what was extraordinary about the release of the war logs and the Iraq war logs was that they were their files, they were their lies, they were their documents. They couldn't be disputed. They were utterly authentic. And so he became, for them, for great power, for the United States and for those in close consort with the United States, he became public enemy number one. Or even worse, he became, as I say, emblematic of a resistance that could build up to the very notion of the United States, and I suppose the West generally, but basically the United States, controlling much of the world's affairs. So he had to be dealt with. But in dealing with Julian Assange, what they are really doing is dealing with us. He is the one suffering. He is the one in Belmarsh prison. He's the one who, as freedom has been taken away and has been put through these Kafkaesque trials, I would call them travesties of trials, but really they represent us because it's taking away piece by piece our right to dissent. If you look at just one very quick example, the way this war in Ukraine is represented, it's represented in the most one-dimensional, jingoistic manner. There's no reason for it, apparently. It all happened out of osmosis, completely unjustified, completely unprovoked. It just happened. And we have to accept that. We mustn't question that. There are many other examples, but that's one that dominates the sort of media consciousness today. So that's why Julian and what happens to Julian is so important to all of us. For me, what happens to Julian is about a terrible case of injustice. But as others have spelled out, it could be the end of any real sense of free press. I don't believe we have much of a free press now, but there are honourable exceptions to that rule, if you like. There are journalists who work hard. There are people who want to speak out. Well, if they succeed in crushing Julian, they may succeed eventually in crushing us. That's not meant to sound paranoid. It isn't. What they've done to Julian Assange should be a warning to all of us who take pride in living in what we hope is a free society.
Which brings us probably to the final sort of question we'd like to ask you, and that's to do with the conflict in the Ukraine and what putting it in the context of what you say, your film, The Coming War on China, and the role of that conflict in on the borders with Russia.
Well, I think looking at the very big picture, the United States, which is the most important power in the world, because what the US does affects us all, often in a very direct sense, has two enemies. The immediate enemy and the old enemy, I suppose, is Russia, where the communist revolution took place, for which Russia has never been forgiven. And the United States ideology, I suppose, has been long and correctly called anti-communism. And even though there is not a communist government, and there hasn't been a communist government in Russia since 1990, that doesn't matter. They're still Reds. And so Russia is the first enemy, but the new enemy, the big enemy, which was always a kind of sub-enemy, is China. China's rise is the most extraordinary phenomenon in my lifetime. In just over a generation, it went from being a country of widespread impoverishment, economic backwardness, to a country that is the, according to some indicators, the biggest, certainly potentially the biggest economic power in the world. That directly threatens the position of the United States. So as I mentioned at the beginning, US policy is basically, to put it in a nutshell, to restore the dominance that it believed it had and did have, and no longer has. We go, to use the cliches, from a bipolar world between superpowers to a multipolar world. There are many competing powers now in the world, but there is a new one capable of competing directly with the United States, and that's China. So I believe that what the United States aims are to deal with the so-called Russian threat and then move on to the main threat, the main game, and that is China. China is a threat almost at every level. As far as the United States is concerned, it actually isn't a threat. Anybody who's looked closely at China or been to China or thought intelligently about China knows that China has it will claim its so-called sphere of influence in economic terms because it's the most populous country in the world, and it's where all our goods are manufactured. So it is a very powerful country, but it has no interest in militarism. As somebody in not somebody, his name is Eric Lee, a very astute commentator in Shanghai, said, we built the Great Wall in China to keep the barbarians out, not to attack them. Mm-hmm. I think that perhaps sums it up. That's China's view of itself. Prosperity, economic development is everything in China. Any suggestion that it spend huge amounts, and it's already having to spend huge amounts, but spend the kind of resources that the Soviet Union did on armaments and thus destroy its economic base, that's anathema in China. But the perception is completely different in the United States. China is an enemy, potential enemy, and in fact, for many in the US, they're already at war with China. So, in some ways, the war in Ukraine, which the United States is fighting by proxy because it's supplying Ukraine with the wherewithal to, it hopes, see off the Russians. It's a rehearsal, perhaps, for what might follow later on. And there's been comparisons made, which I think are fatuous, actually, but they're still made, between Ukraine as a proxy for the war with Russia and Taiwan as a proxy for the war with China.
Okay, that's excellent. Thanks very much for participating, and I hope the media will take up what we're trying to do, but they won't, of course. Anyway,
very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so I think my colleague Detta is going to come on and do a conclusion. Or has somebody kidnapped her?
Hey.
No, she hasn't kidnapped. It was untrue, but there were rumors.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll leave you to finish off, and I'll withdraw.
Yeah, thanks very much, Niall. And yeah, we've all spent over 2 hours on a gorgeous bank holiday weekend listening to a fantastic panel of speakers who've stretched from America to Ireland, Europe, and all the way to Australia. And so I want to thank each and every one of our speakers. And also thanks to all those that made this webinar possible, because to be honest with you, the few of us in Galway Alliance Against War and Free Assange Island, we really didn't have the technology to put this together without other help. So thanks for that. Galway Alliance Against War and Free Assange Island, I now want to talk to the people who are either watching this webinar live or who'll watch the recording when we put it up. And that's basically to say, we really do urge you to get involved, to think global and to act local. We need this sort of discussion happening everywhere. We need to raise these issues in our own communities. And I suppose the very grave word of warning is find out how we're being forced down this road to catastrophe. We have to think global. We have to act local. We have to start rebuilding or building anti-war movements. We need to show solidarity with those around the globe, including in Ukraine and in Russia, who want peace, who want movements for peaceful solutions, and not for a world of even more wars and more violence and death and destruction of people and planet, not for a NATO expansion, and certainly not for further militarisation of the EU, and even for us here in Ireland. And as we've heard, it's essential for whatever we think we've got in the way of democracy, but for a democracy anywhere, defend the public's right to know, for us to know what is being done in our name. We need freedom of the press. And for that, the case of Julian Assange is so crucial. And it's urgent that we take action now if we want to do something to save Assange. So if you want ideas of actions you can take, either for Julian Assange or what we're doing in Galway Alliance Against War, Free Assange Island, what information we're discussing and what articles we're sharing, please do follow us through our social media channels. I believe that someone's going to put the contact details in the chat box for everybody. Also, you can, if you're not on social media, you can contact us by email, and the email addresses will be going up. So I suppose all I can say now is that's it from us for today. Thank you so much again to everybody. And I'd like to sign out in solidarity for peace. Thank you.